Great, good evening. Thank you so much for coming out on a cold Blackburn evening. There we go, brilliant. And my name is James. I help out at Church of the Saviour, and we've got a special guest tonight, Dr. Kirsten Birkett, who will be speaking to us about psychics and the occult. Brilliant, amazing. It's something I'm excited to hear about. And you'll notice I have an accent. And Kirsten, I believe you've got an accent, is that right?
I've never noticed.
So I am South African. Kirsten, where are you from originally?
I'm Australian.
Brilliant, yeah. Brilliant. And tell us a bit about yourself, if that's all right. Or...
Yes, so I came to the UK in 2005 to teach at Occult Theological College, where I met James and some other people around here. And I taught ethics and philosophy and occasionally other things at Occult Theological College for 14 years. Since then, I've done some church work, and I live in Glasgow. I work remotely for a church society and do some editing, writing, that sort of thing.
Amazing. Now, psychics and that kind of thing is an unusual topic. What prompted you to write about that?
I came to the topic in a roundabout way. When I was studying, I did a PhD at the University of New South Wales in the 90s, and that was in the history and philosophy of science. I was looking at people's worldview and how that changed before the rise of science in the 17th century, and in particular, why did people stop believing in magic and start believing in science? So I looked at a lot of the old beliefs in magic. Now, when people heard about that, they immediately started asking me questions about things like psychics and tarot cards, which were not part of the medieval stuff that I was researching, but it was obviously something that people were interested in. So I started researching that a bit myself.
Wowzers, brilliant.
Yeah.
Great. So we're going to hand over to Kirsten. I'm going to warn us there will be a bit of discussion time at the end. So if that's you who withers under discussing things with friends, just to warn you about that before we get there. But Kirsten, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks very much.
Great.
Well, actually, I'd like to get you to do a bit of discussing right away to start with. So could you just please turn to the person next to you or the people around you and just talk for a moment. Where have you come across mention of the occult or anything like that lately, just in society or people you know? Where have you come across it lately? Okay, so what do we think? Does anyone have, is there anything that people have particularly noticed lately that this topic has come up? Yes. That's true, yep, lots of popular films. Yep. Yeah? Oh, interesting. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so surprising people you'll find just mention it casually. It's something that they do. Actually, I noticed Jonathan Ross had a program of seeing if he could contact ghosts. Something like that. Yeah, any other examples? Yes, yeah. The psychic evenings, that sort of thing. Yep, and there's one down there. The Mason, yeah, that's an interesting question. There's lots of debate about that, isn't there? Yeah. I don't actually know, but yeah, that certainly has been very topical in past times. Yeah. Yes. With that. Yeah.
And I went to have a coffee where it was absolutely, we drove off the car, noticed chaplain to the richest country of Manchester.
Oh, my goodness. Yes. It is astonishing how common and mainstream these things are becoming. So go back just 500 years in this country. Now, at that stage, yes, things like magic then were quite common. In fact, there were laws against it. You could be prosecuted for doing magic. But if you move forward in history a bit after that, so a few hundred years between then and now, and it wasn't common. It certainly wasn't something that respectable people would ever talk about or take seriously. And the laws against magic were repealed because people thought, well, there's no point to them. It's like having a law against Peter Pan speaking in Parliament. Well, you wouldn't ever enact that law because there's no such person. And that's what happened for a long time in this country. All the laws against magic were repealed because people started to think it was just nonsense. There's no such thing. But it's coming back again. It's coming back into the mainstream. And we can say that probably there was an undercurrent all along. There were still people on the fringes of society who believed in things like the occult and practiced it. But what we see lately is it's coming back into everyday life. So you can have a TikTok about how you bake a cake, or you have a TikTok about how you do a dance, or a TikTok about how you cast a spell. And they're just things that people do. And it seems that on that level, things like magic and the occult are becoming much more a part of everyday culture. Well, what is it? What is this thing that people are doing? What is the occult? And of course, people can define it in a lot of different ways. Some people think that they are actually contacting spiritual beings. Whether they call these beings angels or spirits or ghosts, you'll find people who are seriously trying to contact spiritual beings. Some people will say, no, what I'm doing is I'm sending out my intention into the universe. And if I think about something hard enough, if I concentrate my will, then I can manifest the thing that I want as I send out my intention into the universe. Other people might say, well, there are magical forces in the universe. Maybe they're ley lines or magical lines of force or influence. And if I say the right words, or if I say a spell or something like that, I can tap into that power. And of course, there are other people who say, well, it's just a bit of fun. It's just, the other night I went to a quiz night, and tonight I'm going to the psychics. It's just something you do for a bit of fun. Of course, there's still people who say, no, it's total nonsense. No such thing. It's all irrational. There's only science. There's only the natural world. There's nothing else. And a lot of people will still say that as well. Well, to be straight about where I'm coming from, to start with, I would guess that maybe 90% of what people talk about is nothing, is wishful thinking or imagination, or just a straight-out con, just cheating people out of their money because people are willing to part with money for something they think is real, and I'm sure there's a lot of con artists out there just taking advantage of people's gullibility. But there is a spiritual world. There is a spiritual reality, and sometimes some of it might be tapping into something real. And at that point, we do need to be careful, and let us not be naive about the fact that there are spiritual forces that do not intend us any good. So, in the end, it doesn't really matter how other people define the occult. What we're interested in is, what does the Bible say about these things? And when the Bible talks about things that we might say are magic or the occult, it tells us there are things that we must not do. It's very strong. There are certain things that we must not do. And so it's good for us to be clear exactly what are those things so that we can avoid them. And of course, we need to remember that we're reading the Bible in English. And when these words are in the Bible, they're in Hebrew or Greek. And sometimes words get translated into English words that have different connotations for us. So maybe a word in Hebrew is translated by the English word witch. And we immediately think of the Middle Ages and women in pointy hats and broomsticks and things like that. And that may have nothing to do with what the Bible's actually talking about. So for the first part of the talk, I'd just like to look at some of the things in the Bible that are specifically talked about and understanding them in their context. What exactly is it that the Bible is forbidding? Now, James, I don't have the clicker for the slides. Thank you. Okay. So let's start in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God's people are told very clearly there are some things that other cultures in the ancient Near East did that the Israelites were not to do. Actually, in the ancient world, Israel was almost unique in that it talked about magic as a clear, separate, and forbidden category. That wasn't necessarily the case in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So in some of the other cultures, in Egypt and Mesopotamia and some of the other countries, magic, religion, and what we might call the natural world were all intertwined. They weren't necessarily thought of separately. So there could be priests, there could be healers, there could be magic specialists, and they might have some different duties, but they all enjoyed equal status and overlapping roles in public life. So, for instance, in Egypt, you had the temple where you did religion and the gods were worshipped there, but magic was part of that temple worship. Magical spells were kept in the temple. And magical spells would be used to get a person's soul to the underworld and help it pass judgment. In Mesopotamia, so the area from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, priests, who were the religious leaders, would also help people who had gone to a magic specialist and received an omen or a portent. The priest would help them do magic to avert the evil. So magic was just another way of using power to achieve some end. And power might come from the gods, it might come from other spiritual beings, it might just come from the universe. So there was no clear difference between magic, religion, and natural things. A healing, recipe could call upon the gods, it could call upon religion, it could call upon a magic spell, and it could also use some herbs, which were natural things. So these categories weren't always distinct. But Israel was different. Oh, there's an Egyptian picture. So that's people going through to be judged in the afterlife would have the magic spells to help them, and you'd have scrolls like this, which were lists of magic spells that would help people. But what about Israel? Now, there's lots of passages I could have turned to, but this one mentions a lot of different magical elements within the one passage. So that's why I thought we'd look at this passage from Deuteronomy. And it says, when you come into the land the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. So notice, start of all, these are abominable practices. God is not just saying, well, these are interesting things that other cultures do. These are horrible things, the things that you must not do. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or daughter as an offering, Anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens, or a sorcerer or a charmer, or a medium or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. Okay, well, so what was happening here? What were the things that they're not to do? Anyone who burns his son or daughter as an offering, we said, well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean, of course you don't do that. But this was part of magic. It was part of child sacrifice, which was possibly propitiatory. That's just meaning that it was to help the god not be angry at the people. But it was also part of their magical ceremonies for divination, for trying to tell the future. So if someone wanted to know what's going to happen in the future, is my crop going to fail? Is my business going to be successful? Should I get married on this particular day? Will that be a good day? In order to find out these things, they would sometimes sacrifice a child. And the questions might be asked of the god, or the questions might be asked to the dead child's spirit to find out the answers. So you can see immediately it's not surprising that God finds these things abominable. This is horrible, that in order to do magic, to get your whatever answer you want, that you would do something like this, sacrifice a child. This is another passage from 2 Kings. They burned their sons and their daughters as offerings and used divinations and omens and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Well, yes, you start to understand why God is so angry about Israel being involved in these magical or occult practices. These are not harmless things. What else are they not to do? Someone who practices divination or tells fortune or interprets omens. In the Mesopotamian literature from the ancient Near East, it does talk about specialist people in the other cultures who were available to tell fortunes or interpret omens. So you would go to this person, possibly paying them money, to say, I want to know the answer to my question. And the things we just talked about, if you want to know something about the future, you ask them the question. And as well as the horrible child sacrifice things we've just talked about, there were other methods that people used. You might kill an animal and look at the entrails of the animal, and that supposedly told you something about the future. Or you might observe the way that birds flew across the sky, and something about the pattern would tell you, yes, next Tuesday is a good day to go to the market, or whatever it might be. So there were all sorts of techniques that these people would use, but the point is you could go to them and find out some information that otherwise it's impossible to know because it's, from the future, something that hasn't happened yet. We also found message in that passage in Deuteronomy, sorcerer. And this term sorcerer comes up a few times in the Old Testament. This is, in general, a magic user, and it's always negative. There are always negative overtones to it. It could be male or female. In Exodus 22:18, it has the death penalty. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. This is a word that's sometimes translated witch. Yes, but don't have your English associations with that word witch. In the Old Testament, it's talking about this professional person who does spells, and it was often connected with doing harm, actually putting curses on people. So you would go to this person and pay to have a curse put on your rival or on your enemy. And it could be associated with death as well. So it's in Malachi, God talks about his judgment on these people. I will draw near to you for judgment. I'll be a swift witness against the sorcerers, against the adulterers, those who swear falsely, those who oppress a hired worker, and so on. So all these evil things that harm people, if you're a sorcerer, that's the sort of thing that you're going to be involved in, doing evil practices that harm people. In Deuteronomy, another thing that's forbidden is a charmer. Now, we might think that's a bit odd. That sounds fairly neutral, doesn't it? A charmer. Specifically, it's talking about a person who casts spells. And it could be related to the practice of tying or wrapping magical knots around something. So you might get an object that represents a person, and you tie this magical knot around it, and then the god or the magical spirit is bound by that magical knot to do your will, to make something happen to that person. And it's just another way of casting spells. A medium is someone who inquires specifically of the dead, of a ghost or the spirit of a dead person. And it's related to necromancy, which is the word for conjuring up a dead spirit. So think of the ghost of Samuel being conjured up when Saul wants an answer to his question. It's that sort of person. So it is very specifically related to calling upon the dead. In other passages, there are mentions of astrology. In general, the Israelites were not to practice astrology, which is looking to the stars for information, maybe about the future or other things. But that passage in Deuteronomy gives you the main things that are forbidden. God's people were not to be involved in anyone who is involved in doing spells. They're not to go to anyone who tries to tell you the future, so information that is magically gained, and they're not to go to these people who inquire of the dead. Now, some things in that passage aren't really done anymore, at least not done very often. I haven't come across anyone who ties knots in order to do magic. But some of the things that are mentioned there are very similar to things that are still being done and are done more and more commonly in our society. Don't know why I put that slide there. But anyway, another negative one. You shouldn't go to these diviners who tell lies. Oh, I know what I put that there, yeah. Sorry, I just got myself mixed up. I gave a different talk last week. I've got my slides a bit mixed up. Okay. Why are these things forbidden? Why are these things forbidden? To some extent, because it's nonsense. And at some stages in the Old Testament, says some of these things that people try to do, they are just nonsense. Yeah, the gods utter nonsense. The diviners tell lies. They tell false dreams and give empty consolation. So that's one reason why you shouldn't go to these people. They're conning you. Or maybe they believe it's true, but it isn't. You're not going to get any help from these people. So that's one reason why you don't do it. Another reason why you don't do it is because a lot of it's associated with idolatry. So a lot of these practices were done in the worship of other gods. And one thing we definitely know from Yahweh, the God of Israel, is you must not worship other gods, because he is the only true God. It's at the very start of the Ten Commandments. Definitely know from Yahweh, the God of Israel, is you must not worship other gods, because he is the only true God. It's at the very start of the Ten Commandments. So anything that's associated with the worship of other gods, with the Baal gods, with the Egyptian gods, or anything else, you must not be involved in that. Anything that means trusting someone other than God, you must not do that. And that seems to be behind some of the prohibition of the divination, of the getting omens. Because you might say, well, what's the harm in that? Just trying to find out, is my business venture going to succeed? The problem is, God tells us things that we need to know, and there are other things that we don't know. And we need to trust him that he is in control and not go to some other spiritual power just because we want to be in control. Also, a very strong reason why these things are forbidden and God's people must not do them is, the association with death. Because so much of this magic was associated with horrible things like child sacrifice or trying to talk to the dead, that is something that God's people must not do. So Manasseh, who burned his son as an offering and used fortune-telling and omens and dealt with mediums and necromancers, did much evil. That's an evil thing to do. Death is not meant to be part of this world. Death is part of the curse. It's a result of the fall. It's not a good thing. And God's people should not be involving themselves with death. And all this magic which calls upon the dead or is associated with death in some way, and especially if it involves killing someone, particularly to do magic, do not be involved. But even if you're not the murderer, just don't get involved with death. This is the message that comes over and over to God's people. God is the God of the living. Do not go and seek out the dead. So, that was the message given to God's people. These slides are jumping about in the wrong order. I don't know why that is. We're supposed to go to the New Testament now. Okay, let's jump to the New Testament. You've seen a bit of a preview of what we're going to do at the end. We're going to have some question time. Yeah, what about the New Testament? What about when we see Jesus coming? Well, of course, Jesus believed the Old Testament and he obeyed it. So we know that whatever the Old Testament is forbidding in terms of not seeking to go to diviners, not seeking to have this information that shows that you're not trusting God, you must not do that, and not being associated with death. Now, Jesus came into the Greco-Roman world. The New Testament world was the world of the Roman Empire and a lot of Greek speakers who were living in the empire and around about Israel. And a lot of these people were very familiar with magic. By this time, it's a different kind of magic from what we see in the ancient Near East. So what we see in Greece and the Roman Empire had slightly different forms from the kind of magic that was done in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and some of the other ancient Near Eastern countries. But it was still considered a very real thing. It was still something that people did. And in fact, our word magic comes from the Greek word, from the magia, which was the thing that was done by the magos, the wise person, who were thought of as Persians. And so that in itself was a reason to be negative because the Greeks were the enemies of the Persians. The word had very negative overtones. You have lots of papyri surviving from the Greek world in which you have written out spells or written out curses with lots of evidence of what people were actually doing in terms of magic. However, it was frowned upon. It often called upon the power of the dead, and it was thought about as something that was very distasteful or outright harmful. Magic was frequently associated with human sacrifice, with perverse sexual practices, and all sorts of evil. In Rome, the practice of magic at different times became a capital offence. So it was thought to be very negative, but real. People believed it was real. It was also very lucrative. So even though it could be outright illegal and have a capital penalty for it, people could still make a lot of money from it. So when the people in Ephesus, in Acts 19, destroyed their magic books, that was a major statement. they were destroying the means of having a very lucrative career because people would pay a lot of money to have a spell done on their behalf. Now, probably a lot of the ancient magicians were just quacks and con artists, the same as today. There were probably a lot of people just making money off the gullible, and there was nothing in it. But something else we see very clearly in the New Testament, and that is that demons are real. People really did get possessed by demons. And possibly some people were able to contact demons. And when we look at the magic that people were doing in the surviving evidence, in the papyri and the magical tablets that have survived, when they call upon the power of the dead, so the spell is specifically calling upon a dead person, a dead spirit, to give power to the spell to make something happen, that frequently used the same language that the New Testament uses of demons. So the word daimon, which is a Greek word which is translated demon in English, that same word would be used in a magic spell referring to a ghost or a dead spirit. So these categories overlapped. We tend to think of ghosts and demons as different categories, but New Testament people didn't necessarily think that way. Sometimes what we might call magic words were used in the spells, so words that were gibberish, they just sounded weird. And this might suggest that people thought weird-sounding words had power in and of themselves. But when you see the meaningful words in the spells, they do call upon supernatural beings, sometimes the gods of the time, but often the magical power came from this category of spirits known as the daimons, the word that is translated demon, and that by that they meant a ghost. And magic was associated with graveyards, with murder, with death. The way that magic was talked about in popular culture is often associated with these places of death. So once again, we see these ideas coalescing. The things that Israel was not to do, the things that God's people are not to do, are things associated with what is fallen about this world. So things associated with the idolatry, which is the human impulse not to worship God, which of course was the start of the fall, when Adam and Eve in the garden rebelled against God because they didn't want to accept his authority. And it's that impulse which humans have carried with them, and that gets associated with the occult things that people are trying to do. And especially the death that came into the world through the fall, that is very much associated with magic, and demons are associated with death. There's the overlapping of the language. And you think of the demon-possessed people in the New Testament, the Gerasene man who would hang around the tombs. There's lots of connections with death, with the demons and with the occult world. Well, in a way, that's not surprising. For we read in Romans that creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of one who subjected it. This world is not as it was meant to be. This world has been subjected to frustration. There are a lot of things wrong with it. And people turn to magic because of this frustration, because they want the power over the world, or they want to know the future, or they want success, or something like that. And part of what they turn to is associated with that very frustration, with the fall, with the death and the decay that has come into the world. But the good news of the New Testament is that was never meant to be the end. So, The frustration was in hope that creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and the glory of the children of God. So that very decay, the decay and death that gets caught up with the occult, that is going to end. We're going to be liberated from that. Well, how does God bring about this answer to death, to darkness, and all the things that go along with it? Jesus died and was resurrected, and so he defeated death. And it's no surprise that in the resurrection, Jesus proclaims his victory over death and over all the evil spirits in the world. So all the things that are associated with the occult, Jesus is victorious over it. This is a passage from 1 Corinthians. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. It's the victory of Christ that is the key message of the New Testament. And a very important part of that victory is the victory over death and the victory over evil, the evil spirits, the demons, the things that are connected with magic. Jesus defeated all evil powers. If it was possible to do actual magic by controlling demons in the past, and maybe that was possible, there's some indication that that's what people were trying to do when they were doing magic, actually get control over a demon and make the demon do things for you. If that was possible, it's certainly not possible after Jesus' death and resurrection, because Jesus has victory. He has defeated those demons. They're still there. We mustn't be naive about that. They are still there. But we don't need to be afraid of them. And those are the two messages that we need to drive home about the occult. Yes, it can be real, and it's evil, it's dark, it's nasty, but in Christ we need not fear it. Evil is defeated by Jesus. He is victorious, so we needn't fear anything associated with the occult. And we look forward to the resurrection when all the evil and frustration of this world will be done away with. When Jesus will bring his people to be with him in a new world without evil for eternity. That is our hope. So Revelation 21 tells us, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Now that keeps us going. That vision keeps us going. Even in this world when we are still subject to frustration and decay and the death that surrounds us, that keeps us going. Now, I want you to pause at this point. What do you get anxious about? And what might make you, I've got that the wrong way around, what might make you want to consult a psychic? Let's talk to the person next to you for a moment. Okay, shall we come back again from that? In the ancient world, if you look at why were people doing magic, why were they going to these specialists? It's because they wanted to fall in love, they wanted romance, they wanted money. Well, those two things still exist, don't they? But also because they were afraid. People were afraid of illness, of suffering, of things going wrong. And I think people are still very afraid of those things. There's a lot of things that would drive people to look for answers. And sadly, a lot of people are looking for answers in the occult world because they think that's where they're going to get the knowledge they need to overcome the uncertainty of life, or maybe even the power they need to overcome the difficulties of life. But there are better answers, aren't they? Did anyone have any observations they wanted to make at that point? Yeah. Yeah. The death of a child is particularly tragic, isn't it? I mean, there's almost no getting over that. It stays with people the rest of their lives. Yeah. Yeah. We long to overcome death because death is bad, death is tragic. It's not just stepping into the next room or all these euphemisms people live. It's a terrible thing, and we want to overcome it. So what we need is good news of someone who's done that. But I think you're right. It's actually driving people to these other areas because maybe they haven't ever heard the good news. They don't know where the answers actually are. But certainly the occult ways of getting answers are coming back in a big way. So I want to look at that a bit now. Our culture is being permeated with a new magical way of thinking about the world. We had the general mysticism of the New Age over the past few decades, in people turning to the age of Aquarius, and there's going to be this new enlightenment and things like that. And of course, that's still with us in all sorts of ways. But I think the technology itself, and in particular social media technology, is bringing a whole lot of the more fringe practices very much into the mainstream. And there's a lot of specific groupings of people who will be labelled themselves as pagans, as Wiccans or witches, or other groups who identify with this new kind of magical spirituality. And people are interested in not necessarily just gaining power, but in developing their own spiritual status. So in gaining enlightenment and a kind of higher consciousness for themselves. You hear people talking about that sort of thing. In a lot of modern witchcraft and magic, a spell focuses the intention in such a way that the universe has to take notice. And I mentioned at the start, there's this whole new phenomena of manifesting, which people don't necessarily call it a magic spell, but it's basically, it's very similar, isn't it? This idea that if you just think about something hard enough, and if you, gather images of it and you concentrate on it and you say this affirmation to yourself every day, and eventually that thing will come into your life. You'll get that promotion or that career or that whatever it is. There's also neo-paganism is coming back in a big way. So ancient religions deliberately being resurrected. There are groups of ancient Norse and Germanic heathens who will try very carefully to get the exact historical costume right and use the historical words and so on. Druids and other Celtic groups. There are reconstructions of the Greek gods, revivals of the ancient Egyptian gods, that's happening too. They're often connected with a strong nationalism. So you revive your own country or culture's ancient religion. Other groups base their traditions on indigenous shamans. So shamans, whether in the Native American tradition or in some of the Asian or Islander traditions. And so they take up things like spirit journeys, drumming, or taking drugs that give people visions, having spirit animals and that sort of thing. A lot of these sort of new religions will be very positive in what they talk about. And they say it's all about you must never do harm. it's just about spiritual development and doing good and harmony and living in harmony with nature and things like that. There's actually a video on the New Atlantic website, which I watched. It was advertising paganism. And it looked lovely. It really did. All these really positive images of people just in harmony with nature and respecting each other and, having these really positive communities. Or why wouldn't you want to join it? It looks really good. There's also lots of people advertising their occult services. You can easily go and consult a psychic or a witch or get your cards read or do a whole range of psychic things, as easily as you go and get your nails done. Well, how should we think about this? What are some reflections on this? One reflection I want to start with is that this proves that atheism just doesn't work. That whole naturalistic program that was forced upon us for so long, people trying to say that the naturalistic, atheistic worldview is the one that we must believe, it just doesn't work. It's inhuman. We cannot live with it, and society cannot live with it. It's unconvincing because it's untrue, and people will react against it. And whether reaction is simply at the level of magazine astrology columns and that sort of thing, the pub psychics and online tarot readings, or whether it's a full-blown religious neo-paganism that you get involved in, with circles and covens and all that sort of thing, whether it is being a chaplain to a witch's coven. The spiritual world will not be suppressed for too long because it's real. It is there, and people will want to seek it out. People will not be satisfied with being told that there is no such thing as a spiritual world, because at some level, people know that's not true. Naturalistic atheism, which is still very prevalent in a lot of academic circles, is profoundly alienating for many people. And so is the kind of disconnected technological world which it seems to spawn, because human beings are worshippers. We were created to worship, and if we don't know the real God, we will find something else to worship. That is just going to happen. I found this quote from this woman. She's a respected academic. She's also a practicing pagan. She says both New Age and neo-pagan magic are thus quintessential products of modernity. So it's modernity itself that created these things. Modernity, this view that atheism is true, that naturalism is true, that science will answer everything, that's what created this neo-paganism, because these are not rejections of rationality, then creative responses to a disenchanted world in which personal spiritual experiences are both necessary to the human spirit and deeply distrusted by the dominant paradigm. So as you're saying, the spiritual is still deeply distrusted by, the dominant academic world, but they are necessary. They actually are part of being human. Rationalism has failed to provide answers because people long for a better world in which there is connection, in which there is relationship and community, and which there is something deeper to the world, in which there is some deeper meaning. They want a vision of a future in which harmony is restored. That's exactly what Jesus gives. It was there all along, if only people realised. And I praise God that people are starting to realise it again. Just last week I was sitting on the train and a young man in his 20s started chatting to him, and I said, I've just been to a Christian conference. And he said, I just became a Christian. He had no Christian background at all. He just came across a mention of Jesus somewhere, and he said the only time he'd heard of Jesus was there was some song they sang in primary school, but he was intrigued enough that he went to church and became a Christian. Well, praise God for that. And I am hearing so many stories, they're just on an individual level, but that seems to be happening. Well, in a way, it's not surprising. People need someone to worship. And praise God that some of them are finding the true God to worship. Well, so that's the first thing. Remember that atheism doesn't work. Now, don't go to psychics, fortune tellers and astrologers. because the Bible is very clear that you should not be going to these people. And whether it was in the ancient world and they were doing it in the Egyptian temple, or whether it's today and they're doing it down at the pub, God's people are not to be seeking these answers from people other than God. We are not to be demonstrating that kind of distrust in God. Yes, it would be lovely to know the future, wouldn't it? Guess what? We actually do know the future. Jesus is going to return. Before then, we don't need to know. If God wanted us to know, he would tell us. But in the meantime, he actually wants us to trust him. So don't go to these other people who are claiming to tell you the future, especially because some of them are specifically trying to contact the dead to do so. And that is another thing that God's people must not be involved in. So do not go to these people. You know, they have been there all along, even during those times when all this magic was regarded as total nonsense. There were still people on the fringes, under the radar, doing this. The problem is that it's now becoming so much more mainstream, but that doesn't make it any better. It might be more socially acceptable, more normal, but it's still just as bad as it ever was. A lot of it is bad just because it's fake. It's a con. It's people cheating people. But if it's real, then it's even worse. If there actually is some spiritual reality they're getting into contact with, that makes it even more so something that God's people should not be doing. Should we be concerned if we see other people, if someone from church that says, oh, you know, I just went and got my cards read, I just thought it was a bit of fun. Well, you should be concerned because they probably are being cheated out of their money, and that is certainly a reason to be concerned. And you should be concerned because there's just a possibility that it might have been in contact with something real. And the spiritual world is real, and there is evil out there. We must not be in contact with it. It's not okay if we do spells. It's not okay if teenagers get out a Ouija board just for a bit of fun. It's not okay to go to mediums or psychics. It's not glamorous. It's not intriguing, it's not interesting, and we shouldn't be thinking of it in those terms either. But it can help us talk to people, because it is tapping into this spiritual desire that people have. And this may be the way in which we can start a conversation. And we don't want to start off by being condemnatory. We may say, oh, you know, I don't know about that because there are evil spirits as well as good spirits, and how would I tell the difference? It is worth raising that possibility. It is certainly good to say, I love to think about the new creation that Jesus is going to bring back and the way in which that does away with pain and death and evil. It is great to proclaim that Jesus brings victory. That when the gospel is good news, it's good news on so many levels. But that is one thing that we can say is maybe good about this new interest in spirituality, is it gives us a chance to talk to people. That maybe in the past when sort of hard-nosed atheism was the rule, it was just harder to get a conversation going at all. So perhaps we can do that. And we mustn't be naive about evil. Spiritual beings do exist, and they are not all good. And part of the problem with the new spirituality is this naive belief in goodness, that everything spiritual is good. I mean, think about the ways in which we describe positive experiences. I went to this wonderful show last night. It was enchanting. Oh, what a nice person. They're so charming. This experience was lovely. It was just magical. We use these words as if they're all good, but they're not all good. And if you talk to someone who actually lives in a culture where magic and the spiritual is part of everyday life, they will tell you it is not good. It is scary. a culture in which shamans and witch doctors are real parts of society is a scary culture to live in. So we mustn't be naive about evil. But at the same time, we mustn't be afraid of it, because we know that Jesus has defeated evil, and those who have his word and his spirit have all the defenses necessary. We need to explain that spiritual evil exists, but we can do that when we remember that evil has been defeated. Christ has conquered evil with his loving sacrifice. So we have the answers to evil, whether ancient or modern. We've always had the answers. We have the message that saw those people back in Ephesus willing to burn their expensive magical books because they knew the answers aren't there anymore. We still have that message, and we have the message that can free people from the grip of the occult, from the fear of the occult, and also from the fears that drive them to the occult. And proclaiming that message should be our response to the occult at all times. Now, we've got some discussion questions that might help you think through some of what I've been talking about. So, James, do you want to go to that now? Okay, yeah. So you talk about it amongst yourselves for a bit. We'll have a little bit of a break while you do that, and then we can have some question time. Okay, does anyone want to draw some conclusions from their discussion there? Or shall we, or any other questions you have, questions from the talk? No.
Right, we just want to, can you repeat the question?
Okay, just tell me, I'll go for you. Yeah. Yeah, so the issue of genuflecting, whether it's a sign of the cross or you prostrate yourself or something like that to ward off evil. Humans are so innately superstitious that we will take something that's perfectly good and harmless and turn it into a superstitious thing. And I think that happens all the time with church stuff. So in itself, making the sign of a cross, why should that be a bad thing? Jesus died on the cross. It's our symbol. It's a good thing to remember. Except when it becomes something that you think doing that symbol in itself gives you some kind of spiritual power. Spiritual power to ward off the devil or to make yourself more holy or whatever it may be. And that's the point at which we want to say, no, don't do it, because you're misunderstanding the gospel. You're misunderstanding what the actual power of the cross is in defeating our sin and saving us from death. So, yeah, I think you're quite right. Because so many people will do it in a superstitious, magical kind of way, that in itself is a reason not to. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's true. I think a lot of people do wear crosses as a lucky charm. And, people who actually don't go to church are really not Christian at all, but they think that somehow wearing the cross will protect them. Yeah, that's totally misunderstanding what the actual power of the cross is. That through understanding the gospel, our relationship with Jesus, brings us into his saving death. It's not that wearing a charm actually helps you somehow. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
because Jesus has the victory, he's won the victory, I'm assuming that a Christian can't be possessed by a demon. Is that right? And I suppose what's the place for a kind of formal ministry of exorcism that Blackburn Diocese will have? Is that something that actually all Christians should be involved with because we have the power to pray and we can tell people about Jesus? Or is there a place for that kind of specialist ministry of exorcism? And is that only for unbelievers or, sorry, waffling, but you get the gist.
You know, an interesting thing, Anglicans had no service of exorcism until the 70s. It's actually a very recent thing. Because as a Protestant church, we said, no, the devil is defeated by Jesus. Christians are not going to be possessed by the devil, exactly what you just said. Christians cannot be demon-possessed because Christians have the Holy Spirit who will not live with evil. It's only in the more recent, rise in interest in these spiritual things that it's been brought back in. And actually, the Anglican service of exorcism is quite different from the Catholic service. I mean, the Catholics had it all along because they have a different theology of, what demons do. The Anglican service, if you actually look at it, it's proclaiming the gospel. And it's praying to Jesus, to God about helping someone. It's not addressing a demon, not talking to a demon. So, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Christians cannot be possessed by a demon. So Christians will never need exorcism in that sense. Christians are still going to be tempted in a way that we can call demonic because precisely what the demons want is for us to believe wrong doctrine. If you look at what the New Testament says about what a demon's going to be doing, it talks about the doctrine of demons, which is believing wrong things. The defense against demons is righteousness, is the word of God, is prayer, is the normal Christian things that Christians do as they're following Jesus. So those are the things that we do, and those are the things that the demons want us to stop doing. So our defense is ordinary, Christian, holy living, believing the gospel, knowing right doctrine, and praying to God. And while I don't think we really need a service of exorcism, if people want that Anglican service of exorcism, primarily what it is proclaiming the gospel and praying about it. Right, yeah. Yeah, it's almost impossible to tell, really. Odd things happen in the world, and there are demons. And if someone does not have the Holy Spirit, if they're not a Christian, then demons probably can influence them. And the more you're in a culture in which the gospel is not preached, the more likely it is you're going to have demonic influence. And maybe that can cause weird things to happen to people. But the answer is still the ordinary proclaiming the gospel, proclaiming Jesus' victory, and praying to God about it. Yes. Yeah. It is, yes. So praying the Lord's Prayer, precisely because it's getting at those things which are ordinary parts of Christian life, to be delivered from evil, to be delivered from temptation. And so that's what we should be concentrating on in our lives too, to be aware of temptation and resisting it. Yeah, they're actually very normal things for Christians to be doing. We don't need to make it something spectacular or dramatic, but wow, it's powerful. Yeah. That's true. It's easy to forget. And it isn't so often in the Bible. The thing we're told over and over in the Bible is remember. Keep on telling each other these things. Keep on reminding each other, because you're right, we do forget.
I think we've got time for one or two more questions. If you've got to run, do run. Anyone else got a question there? Sheila's got a question. Amazing.
I suspect you will start to come across it more as it becomes more prevalent and people happier to be open about being involved in this sort of thing. So I think the sort of evangelistic events and preaching you have can address Jesus' victory over death and over the anxieties about death and suffering. That is what drives people to want answers. You know, specifically addressing evangelism at those issues, I think can be very helpful. Not being afraid of it. I think that's, you know, because for a long time we've been blessed by being in a culture that is not subject to a lot of demonic forces. We've been blessedly free of that. And so we tend to be very afraid if it ever turns up. Don't be afraid. We have Jesus, we have the victory. And so, and part of what people might try to do is to have that shock effect on us, try to shock Christians. We don't need to be shocked. I mean, it's rather nasty, unimportant stuff, really, that we're not afraid of. So, that's just some ideas. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so the issue that in a lot of popular literature, all those characters that used to be seen as very evil have been turned around. So we have good vampires, or, Anne Rice's vampires, who are just lovely people who happen to drink blood and kill others. Yeah, Lucifer. Yeah, the devil is the good guy. It's interesting, they keep trying to portray him, he's really evil, but only by portraying sins that people don't actually think are sins. So you'll have him having a big party. Well, nobody thinks a party is really, nobody's actually that much against dancing anymore. So the fact that Lucifer's dancing isn't really sinful, but that's how they want to portray him as, oh, he really is, so all these ways in which these characters are rehabilitated, or the witch is really the good character, that sort of thing. So in one sense, yes, that does make the whole area a lot more respectable and something that ordinary good people can be interested in. And I think you're right, people can be sort of sucked in and then further down the track find, actually, this is quite horrible. I'm scared now. I didn't realise that there are very dark things in here. On the other hand, it does take away that other thing that you talk about. You don't have the lure of the forbidden, because it's not forbidden anymore. It's mainstream. So it will have different influences on different people. I actually would, in some ways you want to say, the right place for it is in fiction, because so much of what they're talking about is fiction. So let's be obvious, yeah, it's fiction. And for the most part, I don't think children really have a problem distinguishing between reality and fiction. The trouble is when it starts being commercialised. So you have a Ouija board with a Harry Potter symbol on it. Now you're starting to blur the categories. That's where it can start to be. Yeah, exactly. Yes. They do, yeah. Yeah, exactly. I know exactly what you mean. Yes, it can be made very attractive, but praise God that we have something that is attractive because it's true, because it's real. Yeah. But I absolutely agree with you.
Great, amazing. Let's give Kirsty a big round of applause. Thanks so much for coming. We hope you've had a good night. Do stick around, grab some more cake or what. At very least, you would have figured out the difference between Australian and South African accent. And Kirsty's spoken a lot on how the best way to react against psychics and the occult and that is simply to hear the gospel, and tell the gospel to your friends. And so we've got an opportunity. We are looking to do a Christianity Explored course here at Church of the Saviour on the 24th of February. You can come, you can bring your friends, you can bring someone who might be interested. And that's running for 5 weeks from the 24th of February. That's 2 weeks from now on a Monday night. Let's give Kirsten one big round of one applause. And your time is your own.